Imagine a woman who had been someone else's legal property. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that a demanding employer or a difficult family makes you feel owned. A bill of sale, a price agreed upon in a currency that does not account for the fact that the item being purchased has a heartbeat and a soul and a name her mother gave her. That was Lucy Farrow's beginning. Born into slavery in Norfolk, Virginia, around 1851, in a world that had categorized her as something less than a person, before she drew her first breath. And from that beginning, from the absolute floor of what one human being can do to another, she would become the hidden hinge on which the largest Christian revival of the 20th century turned. The pivot point nobody wrote into the history books. The name that got quietly moved to the margins while the men claimed the center. Her name was Lucy Farrow, and before you assume you have heard her story, understand this, you almost certainly have not. Because the movement she helped birth, the movement that now numbers somewhere above 700 million believers worldwide, the Pentecostal and charismatic movement that reshaped global Christianity more than any development since the Reformation. That movement has an official story. It has a face on the cover. It has a man in a pulpit on Azusa Street, and the account of how a small Los Angeles mission became the flashpoint for a worldwide fire. What that official story carefully arranges itself around, without ever quite naming the arrangement, is a woman-shaped absence. A gap where Lucy Farrow should be. And that absence, when you finally see it, tells you more than anything that made it into print. She had no seminary degree. She had no denomination's endorsement. She had no family name that opened doors or a famous face that drew crowds before she opened her mouth. What she had was a faith forged in conditions most people cannot imagine surviving, and a fire she carried through decades that would have extinguished lesser things entirely. The Virginia she was born into was a world built on erasure. The legal infrastructure of slavery did not simply take your labor. It took your name, your history, your right to be known. Children born into bondage were given names that suited their owners, not their mothers. Records, when they existed at all, listed them as property alongside livestock and agricultural equipment. Lucy Farrow grew up in that world. We do not know exactly what her childhood looked like because the people who kept records in that era did not keep records about people they classified as cargo. That erasure was not incidental. It was the system working exactly as designed. The Civil War ended slavery in theory. The 13th Amendment made it the law of the land. But anyone who believes emancipation erased what had been built across 2 centuries of deliberate dehumanization is confusing legal language for lived reality. Lucy Farrow emerged from bondage into a South that remained structurally hostile to her existence in every way it could manage. Jim Crow was not a single law. It was a daily weather pattern. The knowledge that certain rooms were not for you, that certain doors would not open, that your worth was something the world around you was perpetually, methodically, publicly contesting. And in the middle of that, there was the church. For Lucy Farrow, as for millions of Black Americans in the post-war South, the church was the one institution that insisted on the full humanity of its people, with no asterisks attached. Not because every individual within it was without prejudice, they were not, but because the core of the gospel, if you took it seriously, refused the categories of the world outside. In the church, Lucy Farrow was not recovered property. She was a daughter of the living God. That distinction was not abstract. It was the difference between a life with ground beneath it and a life without. She eventually made her way to Houston, Texas, where she began pastoring a small congregation. Let that land for a moment. A woman born into American slavery, who had spent the first years of her life legally classified as less than human, was now standing in a pulpit and speaking life into the lives of a gathered community of people. She was not waiting for the culture around her to validate that calling. She was simply answering it, the way people consumed by a fire they did not choose always eventually answer it, because the alternative, to not answer, is its own kind of slow death. Houston, in the first years of the 20th century, was a city in motion. People were arriving from everywhere, chasing work, chasing a different version of their lives than the one they had left behind, within the holiness movement that had been spreading across the American South and Midwest since the late 1800s. There was a particular hunger beginning to surface. A hunger for something beyond doctrine, beyond correct theology rehearsed correctly in the correct order. People were fasting. People were praying through the night. People were gathering in small rooms and asking God for something they could not quite name but could feel was missing. Some power, some presence, some evidence that the God they had read about in Acts chapter 2 was not merely a historical figure but a living reality, with something to say to the present moment. Have you ever felt that? A hunger you could not satisfy with anything the institution around you was handing out. That is exactly what was building in those rooms. And Lucy Farrow was already in them. Charles Fox Parham was a controversial evangelist and teacher who had, in January of 1901, been part of a remarkable event in Topeka, Kansas, where members of his small Bible school began speaking in languages they had never learned, what the early church called tongues, what the book of Acts described as the sign of the Spirit's arrival at Pentecost. Parham had built a theology around this experience. He believed it was not merely a historical curiosity, but a present reality available to anyone who sought it with sufficient hunger and faith. He was not a straightforward man. His story carries shadows that his admirers tend to skip past quickly. But the doctrine he was spreading was catching something genuine in the religious atmosphere of the era. By 1905, he had opened a Bible school in Houston. And Lucy Farrow was there. What happened to her in that room is the kind of thing that is difficult to describe without sounding like you are reaching for drama that does not need to be manufactured. Because the truth is already dramatic enough on its own terms. Lucy Farrow, a woman who had spent her whole life in a world that told her she was not enough, not educated enough, not male enough, not credentialed enough, not endorsed enough. Lucy Farrow received what she and the others in that room called the baptism of the Holy Spirit. She spoke in tongues, and something in her that had already been burning caught a different quality of fire altogether. But here is the detail that the official histories skim past, if they mention it at all. Among the people who had been attending Lucy Farrow's congregation in Houston was a young black preacher named William Seymour. Lucy spoke to him about what she was encountering at Parham's school. She described the doctrine, the hunger, the experience. Seymour wanted to learn. He enrolled. And the school made him sit outside the door. A black man in Houston in 1905 could not sit in the same room as white students. The segregation was subtle. It was policy. William Seymour sat on the other side of a closed door and listened through the gap while the lectures were delivered inside. He absorbed the theology of Pentecost through a crack in a doorframe, in a country that had decided the doorframe was as far as he was allowed to go. He went anyway. He listened anyway. Because when something is burning inside you, a closed door is not the same thing as a closed case. Lucy Farrow understood this in a way that required no explanation. She had spent her entire life on the wrong side of doors that should not have existed. She had learned, not as a theological concept but as a survival truth built from decades of lived experience, that the God who called you was not deterred by the barriers the called could not cross. She did not let it stop her, not for a day, not for an hour, and she did not let it stop Seymour either. Stop for a moment and consider what is actually happening here. A woman born into slavery is the one who carries this fire to a man who is being forced to sit outside a door. She is the link. Without her, Seymour never receives what she has received. Without Seymour, what happens next does not happen. And what happens next reshapes the course of Christianity in the modern world. One woman, born with a price tag and a bill of sale, the hinge the whole story turns on. In early 1906, William Seymour traveled to Los Angeles to preach at a small holiness mission. He preached the doctrine of tongues. The mission locked him out. He moved to a house on Bonnie Brae Street and kept preaching. And on April 9, 1906, in that small rented house, people began to speak in languages nobody in the room recognized. The fire that had been pressing against every door it encountered finally came through. Lucy Farrow followed. There are eyewitness accounts recorded in the early testimonies of the Azusa Street revival that describe Lucy Farrow moving through rooms and praying over people, and those people then beginning to speak in languages that no one present could identify. One report described a man who had been deaf receiving his hearing. Another described someone who had not walked without pain in years getting up and walking freely across the floor. Whether you receive these accounts as straightforward miraculous fact, or as the testimony of people experiencing something they had no prior framework for, what is undeniable is that the rooms Lucy moved through were not rooms people left the way they had entered them. Azusa Street grew beyond anything anyone expected or planned. People came from across the city, across the state, across the continent, white and black and Asian and Latino believers praying together in the same room at a time when the rest of Los Angeles was rigidly segregated by law and by custom. The secular press covered it with a mixture of bewilderment and contempt. One reporter called it a disgraceful intermingling of the races. He meant it as condemnation. Looking back, it reads as the description of something genuinely extraordinary in that era and that place. And in the middle of that revival, moving quietly through those rooms, praying over those people, was Lucy Farrow, a woman born into slavery, a woman with no platform, no credentials, no institutional backing, and no apparent interest whatsoever in claiming credit for the fire she was carrying. She did not stay. In late 1906, Lucy Farrow boarded a ship and sailed to Liberia. Alone, no mission agency had sent her. No denomination had commissioned her. No board of directors had approved the expenditure or considered the liability. She felt that God had told her to go, and she went the same way she had always gone. Ahead of the permission, ahead of the infrastructure, ahead of anyone who might have given her a more formal certificate of authorization. Picture what that crossing would have looked like. A black woman in 1906, born into the American South, crossing the Atlantic Ocean alone on a one-way conviction. No support structure, no return ticket guaranteed by anyone, no organization waiting to receive her on the other side. Just her, and a Bible, and something burning in her chest that she had never once managed to put out and had long since stopped trying to. What happened in Liberia, by the accounts that filtered back, was significant. Reports described revival meetings where hundreds came. Reports described people receiving the same experience she had carried across the water. Reports described healings, deliverances, things that the correspondents writing home could not fully account for in ordinary language. The Pentecostal fire had crossed oceans in the testimonies of Azusa Street visitors almost immediately after April 1906. But Lucy Farrow had brought it directly, in person in her own hands, to the west coast of Africa, and then quietly she came home. She came back to Virginia, the same Virginia that had begun her story with a bill of sale and a price and a legal system designed to make her nothing. She returned to it without fanfare, without a book deal, without anyone organizing a convocation in her honor. She continued to minister. She prayed. She laid her hands on people. She did what she had always done. She died around 1911 in Norfolk. She was approximately 60 years old. There was no 10,000-person procession through the streets. There was no city that stopped its ordinary business to mark the passing of a woman it had never quite gotten around to noticing. She was buried, and the world that had once tried to own her went right on without recording her name in the places where names get permanently kept. Let that sit for a moment. The men who built the institutions of early Pentecostalism, many of whom owed the fire in their bones to the hands that had prayed over them, or to the testimony that had reached them along a chain that ran directly through a woman they never properly credited. Those men went on to write the books, name the movements, and fill the prominent positions in what became the official account of how Pentecost came to the modern world. Charles Parham, whose later life was marked by scandal, and whose racial attitudes were appalling by any standard, claimed a primacy in the narrative that suited his self-image. William Seymour, who was more remarkable and more honest than Parham in almost every way, was at least written into the account with some of the dignity he deserved. But Lucy Farrow, the woman who had introduced Seymour to the doctrine, who had prayed over him, who had crossed an ocean alone to carry what she was carrying to people no one else was going to. Lucy Farrow got a footnote in the generous accounts and a blank in most others. This is not an accident of poor record-keeping. Records were kept. Testimonies were published. Names were collected and preserved. The absence of Lucy Farrow from the central telling is itself a document, one that reveals something about whose fire gets credited to them, and whose gets quietly absorbed into the general atmosphere and attributed upward. She never answered that erasure. There is no surviving account of Lucy Farrow protesting her obscurity, or lobbying for recognition, or naming publicly what was being done to her legacy. She prayed. She went where God sent her. She put her hands on people who were hungry, and she trusted that what God had placed in her would find its way to them, and she let the rest of it go. That is not the behavior of someone who does not understand what is happening to her. That is the behavior of someone who has made a decision about what matters and what does not matter, and who has made that decision at a level that goes far deeper than strategy or resignation. That is what holiness looks like when it has been refined by a lifetime of carrying fire in conditions that should have made fire impossible. Most people who have been wronged, and Lucy Farrow had been wronged in ways that accumulated across a lifetime, beginning before she was old enough to understand what wrong meant. Most people in that position carry the wound in a way that eventually starts to shape their ministry more than the anointing does. The bitterness becomes the message. The grievance becomes the organizing principle. Lucy Farrow does not appear to have done that. The accounts we have of her describe a woman whose primary business was prayer, whose primary tool was her hands, and whose primary concern was whether the person in front of her encountered God, not whether she got credit for the encounter. That is the discipline the official story cannot explain, because the official story is not interested in the discipline. It is interested in the event. But events do not sustain themselves. They are the overflow of something that has been built in private, in the quiet of a prayer room, or the darkness of a sleepless night, over months and years and decades, until what is inside simply cannot be contained any longer and starts pouring out onto every room you walk into. Here is the image that captures this better than any statistic. A formerly enslaved woman, standing in a revival meeting in Los Angeles in 1906, laying her hands on person after person after person, and watching God move through hands that had once been classified as someone else's property. The fire that the world had decided she could not carry. The hands the system had decided did not get to lay hold of anything they had not been given explicit permission to touch. Those hands, that fire, the one she carried across a continent, and then across an ocean, and back, and never stopped carrying until she had nothing left to carry it with. The movement she helped light now reaches into Canada in ways that trace directly back to those rooms in Los Angeles. The early Pentecostal communities that formed in cities like Winnipeg and Toronto and Vancouver in the years that followed Azusa Street were seeded by the revival whose roots run through a small house on Bonnie Bray Street, and before that to a man sitting outside a closed door in Houston, and before that to a woman who told him what she had experienced and laid her hands on him and prayed over him and sent him forward into the calling that history decided was his. Canada's Pentecostal heritage has Lucy Farrow's fingerprints on it. They are simply not labeled. The question her story puts to anyone paying attention is not a comfortable one. It is not simply the question of whether we will acknowledge her now, though we should. It is the deeper question underneath that one. What are you doing with what God has placed in you, when the world around you has arranged itself to pretend it is not there? Lucy Farrow had every structural argument available for keeping her fire to herself. No platform, no denomination behind her, no institution willing to formally endorse a black woman in the Jim Crow South, doing what the world had decided a black woman in the Jim Crow South was not authorized to do. She went to Houston anyway. She went to Los Angeles anyway. She crossed the Atlantic anyway. Because obedience, when it comes from the level of surrender she operated from, is not a response to favorable conditions. It is a response to a voice, regardless of conditions. There are people in this generation who are carrying something they have not yet released because the institution that should have affirmed it has not gotten around to doing so. Who are waiting for a denomination to ordain what God has already commissioned. Who are waiting for a room to give them a platform for the fire they are already burning with. Lucy Farrow did not wait for any of those things. She prayed. She laid her hands on people. She trusted the fire to do what fire does. She didn't receive a calling she was qualified for by the world's standards. She received one she was willing to cross an ocean for. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a life lived inside the boundaries of what you were permitted and a life lived inside the boundaries of what you were called. 2. She finished at full speed. She finished in the same city where someone had once put a price on her life and decided it belonged to them. And she left that city, having spent every year since emancipation pouring out what no bill of sale could ever have contained and no history book ever bothered to record. She left it as someone who had given everything she was given to give to people God had placed in her path, without asking the world to notice. That is Lucy Farrow. That is the fire. And the fire, as she would have been the first to tell you, was never hers to begin with. It was only ever hers to give away. The God who placed that fire in her hands has not changed. The same fire that could not be owned, could not be segregated, could not be erased from the ledger of eternity, simply because a few history books left it off. That fire is still falling on those who are still seeking it. The question is not whether God is still calling people like Lucy. The question is whether anyone is still willing to go before the conditions are right, before the permission arrives, before the institution catches up with what God has already said. Comment below with the words "I refuse to be erased" if you believe God sees the hidden ones that history forgets, and if you are ready to stop waiting for a permission that was never the world's to give. Don't forget to subscribe to Gathering of Souls for more stories of the forgotten ones. The men and women whose names were left off the cover, but whose hands were on the fire. And join us for our next video, where we follow a man who walked into the most dangerous territory on earth with nothing but a Bible and an unshakable conviction, and quietly changed the story of an entire nation's church before the rest of the world ever learned his name.